Hey, Luke here. Welcome back to the channel. This is episode 3 of our Ansible by Example series where we're using Ansible to work with and configure Windows servers and then also installing SQL Server 2022 editions. Uh, Today we're going to be talking about facts, tags, and also dynamic expression using Jinja 2. Touching on that the next episode, we'll go into a little bit more detail of using Jinja 2 templates. We'll be using those to create our configuration.ini file so that as you do different installations and you want to change configurations, you're not having to keep up with a lot of different ini files. We can templatize that a bit, and then as you'll see in later episodes, we can use variables to create those specific configuration.ini files. But the example I want to use today is doing an installation of SQL Server 2022 Standard Edition. Let's take, for instance, if you're a DBA and you've just been handed a new virtual machine that has 12 sockets and 2 cores each, then that should theoretically meet the capacity. You should be able to use all of those cores with SQL Server 2022 Standard Edition because the capacity limits is 24 cores. However, if you notice here, it says that limited to lesser of 4 sockets or 24 cores. So in that scenario, you would be limited to only 4 cores because or actually 8 cores because you've got 12 sockets that were presented, but you would only be able to use 4 of those sockets, 2 cores each. You would have a total of 8, leaving the other cores basically idle for SQL Server. So SQL Server would come online, and you could see that, hey, it's only able to see 8 of the 24 cores. So that's something that you'd want to avoid. That would Once you got the server into production, you would then have to get with the system admin to take the server offline to change that configuration and then bring it back online so that SQL Server could see all of those cores. With Ansible, we can kind of build in some of that logic to look at that core count or total socket count and let us know that, hey, we're going to stop the installation and go ahead and let the system admin know that they need to go ahead and make that change before we continue the install. So building up our prerequisites and kind of our rules. So that's the example we'll use today. We're going to be using or looking at the processor facts. Before I get started, I'm going to go ahead and go off screen here so you can see everything. But I am considering putting together a course where basically we'll go into a lot deeper dive where I've got a lot more time to do that with Ansible and basically Ansible for SQL Server DBAs. So if that's something you're interested in, hit the link below in the description to join the waitlist, and I'll also be sending out updates as that course progresses. There will also be a link to the GitHub repository to where you can grab this example playbook and this host.ini file and of course the README. But let's go ahead and jump into our host.ini file. Again, if you've watched episode 1 and 2, you're already familiar with this file. It's our Ansible inventory file that we're going to use today. No changes. It's the exact same that I had in episode 2. So we're going to be working with the SQL Servers group. We've got 2 virtual machines that's joined to a Windows domain. It's already had WinRM configured so that we can connect to it using Ansible. And then these are some Ansible variables that we're using for this group. We're saying we're going to connect using WinRM because this is Windows. This is the port 5986. It is over HTTPS, so that communication is encrypted. We're going to use Kerberos, and then these are some of the other Kerberos settings. So let's jump over into the playbook. So the playbook is playbook underscore processor facts. And you'll notice that this one looks a bit different than the one we worked in with episode 2. Uh, some things are the same, some things are not. We're using the built-in debug module for Ansible. And the first task is we're going to get this variable, this Ansible facts, and just return everything back to our terminal window. So you may be asking, what are Ansible facts? Before we get too far along, let's cover that. You can go out to docs.ansible.com. A lot of great information out there. If you have any additional questions, or leave it in a comment, and I'll be reading all of the comments as well. But Ansible facts are data related to your remote systems. In this case, our Windows servers, SRV1 and 2, includes operating systems, IP addresses, attached file systems, and a whole lot more. It is returned in the Ansible facts variable, and that's the one that we're going to use in that first task. And then by default, you can also access some Ansible facts as top level variables with the Ansible underscore prefix. You can disable this behavior by using the injects facts as var setting. And then to see all available facts, add this task to a play, which is exactly what we're going to do first. There are additional facts. So in the first episode where we were using the win disk module, or win disk facts module, if I remember correctly, there's additional facts that you can gather that Ansible doesn't get by default for Windows machines, but there are additional modules if you're working with disk that you can use. So let's jump back into Visual Studio Code. Again, I'm using Windows Subsystem for Linux on a Windows Server 2022 machine and a Ubuntu distribution. So the first task we're going to use or run is this print all facts, and we're going to use this tags to filter out which tasks we run in this playbook. So instead of running everything, I'm going to provide this at the Ansible playbook command and then just state all facts so that we just see the output for that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that so you can see we're running Ansible playbook again. -I, we're passing in our inventory file, and then the playbook is playbook underscore processor facts. I'm using my domain credentials, and then I'm also just limiting our tags to all facts. And I'm going to add one more limit, and we're just going to look at srv1.homelab.local for now. In a second, I'll remove that limit, but that's just so that you can limit to a specific host inside the SQL Server's group. So let's go ahead and run this. All right, we can see the task completed. So I'm going to scroll up. This is all in JSON format. There's a lot of facts that Ansible gathers just by default. So you've got the architecture, 64-bit, the BIOS date, BIOS version, the current date and time on the host machine. If we scroll down, we can see the distribution, the domain, homelab.local, environment, parameters. So the processor architecture, AMD 64, OS is a Windows underscore NT. Number of processors is 16. So that is the total number of cores across all sockets. In just a bit, we'll work with processor information more. But I'm not going to read through all of the facts, but we can see that there's a lot of great information in here just by running that simple task. So if we scroll down, we're going to be using the following facts: processor cores and processor count more. So if you were just if you already knew which fact that you wanted to return to the window and read, you can go ahead and limit that. And let's do that now. So if we jump back into the playbook, the next task is print processor core facts. So here we're going to use the debug module again, but the only variable that we're going to return is processor cores, Ansible facts.processor cores. And we're going to do that by, we're going to limit it by passing in this tag of processor cores. So I'm going to go ahead and take this limit off for the machine. And then here I'm going to change my tag to processor cores. So you can see this time the only fact that was returned was processor cores. On SRV1, we've got 2 cores. SRV2, I've got 4 cores. And that is cores per processor. So we'll jump back and see what the next task is. This is the processor count, and we're going to limit that by passing in the processor count tag. So here you can see SRV1, the total number of processor count is 16. That's basically core count. And then SRV2 is 4. So you'll notice in the facts that there's not a fact that says processor sockets. So we have to do a little bit of division to get those. We're going to basically be dividing our count by our number of cores to get our sockets. And if we look real quick at the VM settings, let me actually switch over to SRV2, and you can see, sorry, SRV1. We look at the settings, processor 16. So you can see here I've got number of processors, so that's number of cores, or I'm sorry, a number of sockets, and then the number of cores per socket. 2 times 8 is our 16 total cores. So if I were installing SQL Server 2022 Standard Edition, I would only be able to see 8. I would only be able to see 8 of these instead of the full 16. So if I had a machine that was licensed for 16 cores, um, and I didn't catch this during the installation, or if I didn't look at the error logs later, uh, basically this machine would be running at half of what it was actually licensed to do. Let's jump back over to SRV3. We're gonna run the next one. Here we switch to use message. Message is where we can create our own message, and then we're going to say the number of processor cores is, and then we're going to pass in this fact. So this syntax is dynamic expression using Jinja. Basically, it's Jinja 2 dynamic expression. We'll get into a lot more of that in a later episode, but just know that we're kind of building our expression into this message. So we're saying the number of processor cores is processor cores, and the number of processors is processor count. And we're going to go ahead and use that tag, custom message. So here we can see our message. Message on SRV1 is the number of processor cores is 2, and the number of processors is 16. And here the number of processor cores is 4, the number of processors is 4. So that basically tells us we only have one socket with 4 cores. Let me go ahead and clear this screen. All right, next up, we're going to, since we don't know the number of we don't have a fact that's specifically set for sockets, we have to do an integer division, and we do that with this task. We're going to use message again. The number of processor sockets is, we're going to take this fact and divide it by processor cores. Let's see, the processor sockets is the tag that we're going to use. So sometimes you'll get this on WSL. I haven't seen it on Red Hat, but it'll say stopped. So essentially that went in the background as a job. You can hit FG to bring that back to the foreground, and then you get your information. Uh, I'm not sure why it does that on Ubuntu. If any of you know, then let me know down in the comments. But here is, we printed the number of sockets. The number of processor sockets is 8 on SRV1, and then the number of sockets on SRV2 is 1. So that's all well and good if you're just working with facts and you just want to return information back to the console. But we want the ability to use those facts or those we want to be able to create our own facts from a combination of other facts. If we have to do arithmetic or any kind of expressions, then we want to save that information into a fact instead of just printing it out. So that's where our next task comes into play, is we're going to create a custom fact for the number of sockets so that in a later episode, we'll actually use that fact uh, as a prerequisite task before we install SQL Server to check and make sure that the sockets are configured correctly. So we're going to do that by using Ansible's built-in set fact module, and then processor sockets, that's going to be our fact. And then we're basically going to take this expression and then put that value into the processor sockets. And the tags is set fact, so let's do that. Now you won't see any output for this fact on this time, but you will in just a second. All right, so we can see that gathering facts, custom fact for number of sockets ran. The result was okay. So nothing to return because we set a fact and Ansible has that fact to use in later plays or tasks. So this time we're actually going to run these two plays, or not plays, tasks. So we can see that this time we printed our custom fact. We just used the var processor underscore sockets. And the first one is SRV1 is 8, and the sockets for SRV2 is 1. So that's, in a nutshell, using Ansible facts for a real-world example that we'll use in a later episode. We'll keep building on this as we get further along. Again, if this is a series that interests you, go ahead and be sure to subscribe and like the video, and then check out the links down in the description below to get on the wait list. Thanks a lot for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next episode.